By the way, could we just get a glimpse into your experience right now? What I'm driving at is that I have a lot of students approaching me with a question. I particularly teach like C1, C2 level students, and they frequently ask me, so they're not making like any slips or grammatical inaccuracies, so their grammar is quite good. It's fantastic. So it's more about the usage of language generally, vocabulary, lexis, stuff like this. And they frequently say, Natasha, I feel confident about my English, but when I start using this kind of complicated words, sometimes I feel lack of confidence because I'm afraid that I might not be using something appropriately. I might not be using something precisely. So you see, it's a kind of about making mistakes, but a slightly different aspect. So they are trying to use the vocabulary, which is very ambitious, very precise, with very complex meanings, idioms particularly, right? Because it's like a separate field. And they feel that they might not be using something appropriate. And sometimes they don't use something appropriate, don't use something precise. So how would you approach this? Does it mean that they have to be more careful or stop using this advanced vocabulary?
No, it's basically like as if you're making a clay model. Just keep throwing clay at it and just keep playing with it until you finally produce something. It's going to be a mess to begin with, but then you kind of start molding it and playing with it over time. You'll eventually shape something great. And when you were talking, I was just imagining your personal VK page or your community. It's about exposure. It's all about exposure and having a list of examples, like several, because one of the things is about idioms and some of these, say, collocations, and I'll give some very good examples in a second. If you take the book by Cambridge, the classic book, Idioms in Use, which I kind of did some presenting on in my Telegram channel, the problem is that every idiom is explained in the most basic way. There is just simply not enough information to support it. That's why people don't use them. The idioms which are used are those which have an equivalent in, say, Russian, which are simple to use, or those which are kind of quite unusual are going to be used a lot less, because we're not told about, like, if it's used sarcastically, if it's used rhetorically, if it's a standalone idiom, if it's used maybe with conditionals. But we can't supply that amount of information because otherwise a simple book on idioms would be the size of an encyclopedia, and no one in the publishing world would do that. So the key issue when it comes to a lot of advanced vocab, a higher level, is there aren't enough examples around to solidify that understanding and confidence that this is how it's used. So another kind of interesting example, and I tell this to my speaking club students, that I very rarely take examples from the Guardian newspaper. Now, the Guardian newspaper, even though it's a very good source of English, it's a good source of pompous, arrogant English, because first of all, they really mix stylistics a lot for stylistic purposes. And secondly, a lot of the collocations and expressions are just purely made up by the author because they seem to work. And that's when a student might actually read the Guardian article, take that collocation, and I would see it and go, that just sounds bizarre. And then they would be confused because they said, well, I got it from the Guardian. It's like, well, it's been made up. And so the problem is that there is no way that the student can sort of really know. But then in a lot of cases, it's just about, okay, if you find a collocation, type it into some apps. Do you see it in other places? If yes, then it's a high frequent collocation and can be used. And I think that a lot of it, say, especially C1 and C2 level, is just kind of trial and error. I would also, as a teacher, just try to find sources which are very generic. I do often say to students, like, read the Guardian, but don't take it so literally as the bearer of the English language.
Absolutely. So we have to be very selective. I do use the Guardian a lot, frankly speaking, in my teaching, but of course, it's like you do it with very, very great caution. I use it on like very kind of really good and standard establishments, but of course, we need to understand who's behind the Guardian. Those
exactly.
Very right English kind of people who are very intellectual. They often have a lot between the lines, so to speak, and they use the language that will help them express this kind of between the lines message, which is often very sarcastic, hence the very posh style and stuff like this.
Yes, exactly. It's still a great source of English. It's very rich. And I think that, like, it comes down to us teachers to explain that, like, okay, if you wanted to, let's just say, find very high quality standard English for film reviews, go to Google Film Reviews. Just type in a film review into Google search, first link, perfect reviews. If you wanted to play with stylistics, read The Guardian. If you wanted to find a lot of technical language, read the BBC. you know, and I think it comes down to us to provide those sources for exposure. And I think that like it's just really really difficult, and I do sympathize with students a lot because, you know, as you get to higher levels, you just sort of become less unsure of like, well, what is correct and what's not, you know.
That's true. That's true. Absolutely. And you see, why I've kind of brought this question is because sometimes we think that, okay, I'm an advanced learner, and I want to use some ambitious words which are more complex, more precise, consequently less frequent. And sometimes we kind of we feel that we might sound a little bit awkward, or somebody tells us that we do. Sorry, sound a little bit awkward. But this is where we start expecting that some teacher will come and correct us. And of course it works, but unfortunately the language at C1 and C2 is so vast that you won't have enough teachers to correct you.
Yes.
But most importantly, you don't need, you know, because some students say, oh, you know, I need a teacher to correct me. You don't, because you don't need this amount of correction to really make progress. You will just note under with it, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make, Natalia. Sorry if I can interrupt there. I think you just really hit the nail on the head, because basically what we're kind of saying is that, you know, when you get to C1, C2 level, you have essentially mastered the varsity of grammar in English and, you know, like 90% of common language. So the mistakes that you're making, even though it's like a kind of maybe like an odd collocation, slight misuse of an idiom, they're actually very minor mistakes. You will still nevertheless be completely understood.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yes, absolutely. And some people get a little bit more ambitious than just being understood. They want to sound natural. And guys, this is where your exploration comes in. So in order to sound more natural, just explore, keep learning, not just the language, but also about the language. So how this phrase is used, what stylistic effects it has. So say, in order to sound more natural at high levels, you don't need a teacher, you need yourself. You need to
absolutely.
Read dictionaries, read corpora, watch films. And you know what kicks in at this point is exposure. Listening, reading, and you're going to absorb this natural language, and you'll keep polishing up your own language, right? So you see, because normally when we have a problem, what we want another person to come and correct us. But at high levels, it works in a completely different direction. Naturalness and correction comes from you, right?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Read, listen, and you start kind of developing this language instinct, so to speak, or an eye for good language. And you start to polish up your language by yourself. So it's not that some teacher should come in, but you should read, listen a lot. And this is why in my courses I do force students to read and listen a lot, because this is
your courses are magic. Because I mean, you know, I know that for a fact. I've heard very good feedback about your course. I've never heard anything bad ever. And the fact that you actually do provide, you know, the access to discovery and material and context is very rare these days. Rather than providing mind maps or something like that, you actually provide a source of like deep understanding. I agree with everything that you said, because, you know, there's one kind of phenomenon that